Brexiter. Given the current state of Brexit negotiations and the floating of a second referendum from the attention-clinging political necromancer Farage, it is worth re-evaluating what on earth the whole point of this was. Admittedly, the dire handling of Brexit by the government, which has had about as much success as David Cameron's sausage factory, has not helped with any understanding of what the hell is going on. So let's take a run through of the events that have landed us where we are. 1975 was the last time the British public had a say in our membership of the then EEC, which we voted overwhelmingly for. In 2010, the Daily Express demands Britain's removal from the EU, fuelled by the rising popularity of Nigel Farage and his merry band of the I'm Not Racist But Brigade. Over the next couple of years, this notion gained traction amongst voters with a rise in UKIP votes across local, national and European elections. David Cameron then promised a referendum in 2013 if the Tories won the 2015 election.
We will give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice: to stay in the European Union on these new terms or to come out altogether.
He also promised not to touch any more pigs. Cheers, Dave. After winning this election, Cameron announces in February 2016 that the date for the referendum will be June 23rd, and the rest is unfortunately history. Now, during this time, there were several televised debates, programmes, radio debates, all surrounding the topic of Brexit and what it would mean for Britain. Now, the level of debate equated to a group of fantasy writers attempting to conjure up the greater dystopian image of the world if the other side won. If we left, World War III would commence, leaving Britain to be a barren, post-apocalyptic wasteland. If we remained, we would become part of the EU mega-super-state led by the Germans that would force upon us their strange language, currency, and Britain would no longer be a nation. All our history would be rewritten by the bureaucrats in Brussels. The fact is, both sides proved to themselves to know only one thing, and that is nothing. Neither side had any idea of what would happen, and they still don't. Instead of factual and thought-out policies being offered, we have been given sound bites that sound more like descriptions of fucking cheeses than genuine political options. Hard Brexit is going to be a tough, no-nonsense red Leicester, firm but ultimately grim. Soft Brexit is going to be a mellower, easygoing cottage cheese, invoking a lovely image of Little England, but again, essentially shite. Then there is the epitome of this shambolic discourse, the idea of the no-deal Brexit. The disgusting stink-out-your-fridge cheese. The longer you leave it, the longer its terror reigns, with no idea on how to move on, with the ominous odour permeating your very soul, with its nightmare-inducing stench, braved only by your taste-blind, nose-blind, tone-deaf grandad who won't have it that the cheese is the culinary embodiment of death. How on earth there can be apparently serious political players advocating the notion of a no-deal Brexit genuinely baffles me. At least with the hard and soft descriptions, there are some vague ideas as to what they'd actually entail. A no-deal Brexit is emblematic of our completely broken political system, a bunch of overprivileged old white people playing with the rights and livelihoods of millions. Just this week, newspapers have highlighted a no-deal Brexit would mean no planes could fly over EU airspace. How bonkers is that? The idea of taking our country back would finally have a meaning. It would mean taking our country back to the 1920s before we could fucking fly. All of this madness really does beg the question of why are we doing this? Well, let's try and have a look at what exactly the arguments were for Brexit and against it. The EU is by no means a perfect institution. Overly bureaucratic, undemocratic in its upper echelons, and guided by a corporatist consensus, the EU is certainly flawed. For an example of the bureaucratic nitty-gritty that seems embedded in its functioning, there are regulations regarding the size and shape of fruit and veg, such as cucumbers and bananas. While seemingly arbitrary, part of the purpose is to shut out competition from external producers, keeping fruit and veg from EU countries as the main exporter to other EU countries. It turns out if you start regulating girth, it keeps out Africa. Who knew? Claims of the lack of democratic accountability in the EU have been massively overstated. The idea it is run by bureaucrats in Brussels and by unelected heads of the Commission are simply false. However, it does have its shortcomings. The European Council still holds its meetings in private and does not fully publish its minutes, meaning there is a clear lack of transparency. This was seen particularly in the TTIP trade deal, which was essentially drawn up behind closed doors between multinational corporations and the European Council of Ministers. The deal itself was essentially going to gut regulation surrounding workers' rights and corporation tax. This triggered the Alex Jones Illuminati conspiracy theorists beyond all belief. This ties into its generally neoliberal consensus. Whilst the EU has claimed to be an institution that upholds the rights of the people, for example, the people's right to work and live freely in all other member states, deals such as TTIP and the preconditions to receive EU loans and bailouts show a side of the EU less concerned with rights and freedoms and more dedicated to the expansion of vested interests. The devastation of Greece is an example of the EU dictating to a small nation, essentially saying play the game by our rules or no money for you. Also, despite both sides misrepresenting the debate on immigration, the EU does have a genuinely discriminatory immigration policy. With certain sectors being given protected status, such as engineering, engineers from Australia or China cannot operate freely within the EU, as priority has to be given to EU citizens. However, were these the arguments we heard during the Brexit build-up? Not really, no. We heard a lot of screaming about 500 million Romanian immigrants invading our shores and both simultaneously stealing your job whilst also claiming benefits, a phenomenon we like to call Schrodinger's immigrant. Which one is it? Is it your job or your benefits? However, the benefits of the Remain side were firstly, you weren't voting in line with a bunch of wailing racists demanding our country back from people who they've never met, never seen, and if they have, those are the all right ones. Now, not everyone who voted Brexit was a racist, but you can bet your bottom dollar all racists were proudly declaring June 23rd our Independence Day, the fucking dunces. The EU has provided and guaranteed workers' rights, environmental protections, life-saving scientific research, incredible university facilities and opportunities, convenience of trade and travel, and most importantly, peace. No one can deny that under the EU there has been no wars between member states, a point that should perhaps be more potent for those invoking images of Churchill and true patriots to defend Britain. Our grandfathers fought and died for peace and unity, not a divisive tribal Europe. The rise in race-related hate crimes since the vote have unfortunately embellished all that was wrong with the Brexit debate. It wasn't about sovereignty or anti-corporatism, it was about us and them. And on that sad note, I'll leave you, but with a final flutter of hope. History shows us that whenever there is a swing towards one path, the future often holds a very different outcome. With the right debate and reconciliation, this country doesn't have to go down an isolationist past, dragging us backwards. Instead, we can have a brighter, better future together. I've been Max Duce, and that's the way Europe crumbles.